welcome to everybody. In return, we would also like to pay our respects to elders past, present and those upcoming, and acknowledge the first storytellers and artists of this land. It's a great pleasure and a privilege for us all to gather here today. My name is Vicki Hastrich, and I'm here to talk all things creative with one of Australia's most celebrated authors, Charlotte Wood. Thank you. You might have to clap again in a minute, because I'm not going to say Charlotte needs no introduction, because she clearly does out of politeness, but also because it demonstrates a point. The creative life she's led and the depth and breadth of her literary experience are really quite astonishing, making her more than ordinarily qualified to have written this book, The Luminous Solution. As the author of 6 acclaimed novels and now 3 works of non-fiction, Charlotte has been much awarded, most recently for her sharply observed international bestseller, The Weekend, picking up the Australian Book Industry Association's Literary Fiction Book of the Year Award in 2020, as well as shortlistings for the Stella Prize, the Prime Minister's Literary Award, and it goes on. And prior to that, Charlotte's courageous novel, The Natural Way of Things, won the 2016 Stella Prize, the Indie Book of the Year Award, and was joint winner of the Prime Minister's Award. Animal People, The Children, The Submerged Cathedral, all her novels have attracted accolades right back to 1999 and her debut novel, Pieces of a Girl. During those 25 years and more of fiction writing, Charlotte has written feature essays and articles for the New York Times, Literary Hub, and all of Australia's major newspapers. She's taught writing and mentored many. She earned a PhD with a thesis examining creative processes, and at one stage she also produced a bi-monthly online magazine for 3 years, featuring in-depth Q&A interviews with writers. And those series of interviews were published in this book, in the Writer's Room in 2016. And that was the year Charlotte was made the inaugural fellow at the University of Sydney's Charles Perkins Centre, where she remains an honorary associate, and where groundbreaking scientific research is done using a multidisciplinary approach, which includes input from the arts. Charlotte's also put together a podcast series, and that featured interviews with writers and other artists. So given all this, it's not surprising that Charlotte was made a member of the Order of Australia AM for significant services to literature in 2019. But that was over 3 years ago, and if you know Charlotte, you know she doesn't stop. And somehow in the midst of all this action and busyness, Charlotte's also found time to make and maintain many rich literary friendships. And if you're lucky enough to be one of her correspondents, you'll know she writes the most delicious emails, full of wit and candour about the writing life. Please join me in properly welcoming the very industrious and hugely talented Charlotte Wood.
Thank you. Thank you, Vic, for that outrageous introduction.
Well, it was lengthy, but it proved a point. Charlotte, I just want to make an admission up front that we're friends, and we've been friends for 25 years.
You sound ashamed of that.
We met. No.
Confession.
We met as beginner writers over 25 years ago now. And I've watched as Charlotte has always strived to better herself as a writer through improving craft, but also through trying to understand creativity itself. What is it about creativity that's just captured your interest for so long? Is it because it's just so infuriating?
It is infuriating, as you well know. Vicki, by the way, is the author of a magnificent book called Night Fishing and several other books, and you must read it and buy it after this session. So, I don't know, I think my interest in the creative process of all kinds of creativity, I think it's because when you see the finished thing, a painting, a film, whatever, a book, it seems so whole and formed, and as if it sort of was born as one, entire object. And yet, as soon as you start looking behind that, what happens leading up to that, it's so chaotic. It's completely, you never know how to do it. I mean, we've been writing for 25 years. You still struggle the entire time trying to figure out how to make this thing. Even you learn things along the way, but you never master it. And so I'm one of those people who always loves, pictures of writers' desks and painters' studios, and I think partly that's because the chaos of that is so comforting. That you know that even the greatest artists have this sort of striving, iterative. They just have to do it again and again and again and again till the final thing is formed. And then it looks like it's just effortless. But it's so full of effort.
Well, you've been studying that effort for a long time and writing about it. But it was really COVID that made you want to collect that thought together and reassess it, to bring it together into this book.
Yeah, so I'd been writing, bits of essays and sort of journalism, although none of the journalism really made it into the book. But so I'd had a lot of stuff that I'd written years ago, some more recent, little short pieces. And, my publisher had said, some time ago, why don't we do a collection one day of stuff that you've already written? And I sort of resisted that because I didn't want to have just a kind of collected essays thing. Because sometimes they feel quite bitsy and, randomly put together. But I realised that this interest of mine in the creative process has just been building for, decades. And I actually, when I did sort of freelance writing these days, it really is only about that sort of stuff. Sometimes profiles of other artists, but a lot about the way my own work comes together. So when the first lockdown happened, I don't know about you, but I completely lost my mind. I was really frightened. I was incredibly stressed. Just the uncertainty of that, what was going to happen. Would people we love die? Would our livelihoods vanish? It was kind of a completely anti-creative state, frankly. And in the PhD that Vic mentioned that I did, some of the research that I found in there was about the most creative versus the least creative mood states. And that state of high anxiety is pretty much, in the cognitive research, shown to be the least possible creative mood state. So I wanted to work, and I think a lot of us writers felt like, well, this should be a perfect time for us. We're at home, we can't travel, we can't go out and do events, so we've got all this focus time, and yet I could not focus enough to work on my novel. And then I realised, but actually what I could do was go back to lots of these pieces and see, it's sort of partly see if I still believed what I'd said before. Some of these things were written 20 years ago. And so then when I went back to those ones, a lot of them I didn't feel the same way anymore. So I went back into them and rewrote them.
It was a really good opportunity for you to reassess and rethink, and you even wrote some new pieces.
Yeah,
too,
there are quite a lot of new pieces, which it was such a satisfying job to bring this together, reinvestigate some of the topics that I had, basically matured on. When I was writing about this stuff in the first place, sometimes I was like, why did anyone let me write about that? I didn't know anything. So then I could go back and go, well, you know, a bit of that's right, but I've got a much deeper understanding of it now. So I did that, and then it was really satisfying putting them together as a whole book rather than just sort of randomly, you know, collected things. And it turned out to be a very nourishing project for me, and I've had really lovely feedback from people who felt that it was just, you know, it came out at the end of last year, or September last year, when we were just out of our big lockdown. And it was just seemed to be one of those, you know, fortuitous timing things, that it was the right book at the right time for some people.
Well, when I think right back to the first of your sort of formal investigations, it was initially into craft issues, practical matters, and I think the very first mission you set out for yourself was to address the "she said nothing and turned away" issue. Can you tell us about that? What does that term mean?
So we have a collection of our dear writing friends, and our friend Tegan Bennett Daylight, who is a beautiful writer, fiction writer, and sort of increasingly non-fiction writer, but she and I used to compare notes about our early stories and novels, which basically were very, you know, what publishers call quiet books, which is like death knell to publishing. But sort of restrained, you know, understated, spare prose.
Haunting, lyrical.
Haunting and lyrical. But nothing happened, you know. And so we would sort of laugh. I came to understand that my big problem was that I would constantly have these sort of shy young women who would have all these deep feelings but never express them, and the kind of sort of shorthand for it, I would say, and she said nothing and turned away. And it's sort of, and now it's kind of, you know, when we're talking about books that we've read, it's like, oh, what's that like? And it's like, oh, you know, it's very she said nothing and turned away. So what I came to understand was that I had a fear of being explicit, really, a fear of drama, which for a novelist is not a good fear to have. And a fear of the conflict, and a fear of actually saying something, a fear of putting my thoughts into the world in a kind of energetic form. And so I did sort of really labour to understand how to get a sense of drama, narrative tension. I really love all that sort of craft. And one of the great things about writing books is you have to use every single part of your brain, you know, every single way of thinking is applicable. So there's a sort of dreamy, loose, associative, you know, what we think of when we think of artists, you know, having ideas. That's lovely, but then you have to shape them and craft them and control them, and that's really satisfying. And
in this instance, you decided to pick the brains of a screenwriter, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
As part of the way of addressing the issue.
Yeah, a friend of ours, David Roach, who's a very experienced screenwriter, we would sort of realise that we needed to learn something, and then we would look around the people we knew and go, they can tell us. So we had these little sort of slightly formalised workshops just with our mates, you know. We would, and actually I've written about that in this book, about creating your own classroom, creating your own teacher, finding your own teachers. And David was great, because screenwriters can't have this she said nothing and turned away issue. There's you know, you can't say nothing in a film. I mean, I'm sure you can, but it was sort of that employment of drama and the craft of narrative tension and urgency, and how to make abstract things concrete. You know, things like David would talk about image systems, and it was so thrilling to go, oh, there's all these tools out there actually. It's not just you think of a story, there are all these ways of controlling the narrative and creating tension and urgency. And then as you get better at it, these things all happen together, the kind of dreamy stuff and the what's called in the research, there's divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And the divergent thinking is that loose, random, associative stuff that happens when you're going for a walk and you've been trying to work out some problem, and then suddenly when you're in the bath or in the shower or going for a walk, you have that little light bulb moment. So that's sort of divergent thinking. But then all the craft stuff is convergent thinking, where you're narrowing and selecting and discarding, stuff that doesn't work. So I don't know where I went with that.
And you're using your more logical brain for those sorts of tasks. But, there's you can learn all you like about craft, but writing still remains hard. And you wanted to know why is it so hard, and does it have to be so hard? And that was a good part of your doctoral studies. Tell me about the grumpy struggle cycle.
Yeah, the title of my book comes from a quote by an American writer called Janet Burroway. And actually, Vicki, if you don't mind, I'll just read the quote, because I've
got the quote here, if you want.
Oh, do you? So well organised.
Maybe I don't.
I know where it is. So, the luminous solution, as a title, comes from this quote.
Wait.
Here it is. So, American author Janet Burroway talked about her writing process. So, once I'm working, the process is much the same in every genre. The effort to get myself to the computer, a period of grumpy struggle, despair, the luminous solution that appears in bed or bath, joyful work, repeat, repeat, repeat. And that to me was just like, that absolutely nails what it's like. And so the grumpy struggle is this sort of sense of, sometimes I think it's like you're trying to start a car that won't start. So you have to be in there, you keep turning the key, you keep just that that awful feeling, and then finally at some point it turns over. But that can take, a year of writing in that where it's not going. But then once that motor starts, like, oh, thank God. But it might conk out again very soon.
So it's very much a cycle at every stage. It's not something you go through once.
No, unfortunately. And in the research that I did, when I did this PhD study, I wanted to do a little longitudinal study of some writers that I knew, because all the research that I'd read was really interesting, but it didn't seem to exactly chime with what it was really like. And one of the things that I found in the existing models of creativity were that they were quite orderly steps and stages. So there was, I can't remember them all now, but there's sort of percolation, something or other, illumination, then, verification. So these sort of steps, and there's your, creative work. But what I knew from my experience was that, A, those steps would come at all different times. There was nothing orderly about it. And you also had to do them over and over and over and over again. And so that's what I sort of found in this research, that other people actually felt the same way. So a lot of the studies that are done are of classrooms or sort of slightly artificial scenarios, not real-world working artists. So that was really interesting to me, to try and articulate how it actually works in this bunch of people that I knew.
Well, the research also confirmed what you suspected, and that was that creativity wasn't just about problem solving. Anyway, it was about problem creation.
Yeah, this is it's a slightly...
Or problem finding,
yeah,
I think
problem
is the
finding,
term.
problem creation. It's a little tricky to talk about, but there's this wonderful researcher who many of you will know called Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and he's the guy who wrote the flow books. You know those books on flow? And so he and his co-researcher in the 70s came up with this concept called problem finding. And it was sort of a criteria for creativity that really original creative work doesn't come from just getting a topic and then expressing it. There's a lot of time in the beginning that's taken up with what they call problem finding. So their kind of big study was they got a bunch of visual artists and gave them a whole bunch of objects and said, here's a table full of objects, take some of these and go and make a still life. So they found that these people broke into two groups, just naturally fell into these two different types. And one was the first people would go and grab a few objects, go and put them on their table and start painting their picture or making their sculpture or whatever. But the second group took much longer to choose their objects, and then once they chose them, they took a really long time to arrange them in a way that was satisfying to them before they got down to work. And so these people they called problem finders. They took much longer to set up the problem, which is the material, and then they could get to work. And then afterwards they had
Can I interrupt? Did they often, am I remembering this correctly, that they often put things together that you wouldn't necessarily expect? It wasn't that they were looking for things that more naturally go together or obviously go together.
Yeah,
they were just looking at finding interesting
relationships that were sort of surprising. Well, that is one of the, I'm not sure if that was gone into in that study, but that's definitely one of the hallmarks of creative thinking is connecting things in surprising ways. So bringing together things that don't fit and making them fit. And that's the kind of art, really, is in that making them fit. Anyway, there's a long ramble about that I won't go into. But I called my thesis Looking for Trouble, and that was the way that Philip Roth talked about it. He said, when I'm starting a novel, in the beginning, for a long time, I'm looking for trouble. I'm looking for something that resists me. Because if it's too fluent in the early stages, I know it's not going to work. And it's something to do with not having enough depth, not having something to grapple with as the creator. You need sort of, and I think we've always find this, and sometimes in a book, it's about finding the right form, for me anyway. It's sort of, it's hard to describe because it's almost bodily in a way.
Yeah, and the problem has to be big enough to keep you going and complex enough to keep you going on this journey to nut it out. Because,
and too hard.
Yes.
Like, that's one of the, I think the artists that I most admire often talk about reaching for something that you're pretty sure you can't do. And that's how you develop as an artist, to keep trying something harder. And it might not be hard for somebody else, but it's hard for you. And it's such a personal thing. What is hard for me will be easy for Vicki. But that doesn't matter because it's still my particular... It is a kind of quest in some ways, isn't it?
Yes, and you're setting up a problem that is unique and that only you can solve, actually.
Yeah, and that's the process of making your creative work, is this completely unique problem or set of problems that you then have to solve and then make work together.
But you did all this work trying to... you found out all this information about creative processes, but did that actually help you then more easily create new work, Charlotte Wood?
Well, of course, that's what I hoped. Was, now I've got these, so I discovered these 9 processes and I've worked out what they're all called and where you use them, when you use them. And then I discovered, to my disappointment, but also actually to my joy, that it doesn't help. It doesn't, knowing these things, it helps in a kind of diagnostic way. It helps when I've got a mass of material that I'm like, something's wrong with this, what is wrong with it? And then I can go, okay. So I can bring in that sort of knowledge that I gained and go, maybe I could try this thing to solve it. But that's the great thing about art, is that it comes from a mysterious place.
The mystery's still there.
You can't just go, I've learned these. Like when you first start writing, I've got so many books about writing that are all about rules, you know, and there's so many books about writing that say, okay, here are the elements of a novel: dialogue, plot, character, setting, blah. And you go, oh, fantastic! Just get these 5 things and do them. But of course, you can have all those and have a work that is lifeless. So the life force comes from some other more mysterious place, and that's the gift. You know, that's the joy, really. When those gifts come, it's like there's no other feeling like it. That's why you keep doing it, right?
Well, yeah, because the despair stages are very real, let's face it, and they can't really be guarded against completely either. But though we need to be wary of the romance of artistic despair too, don't we?
I don't like the whole tortured artist thing. It sort of fetishises the difficulty of making art. And when, you know, there is so much joy associated with it, it's hard in this country to be a working artist. It has been very hard. I'm so elated that we have an arts minister now who has a piano lesson once a week, who has music in his office. Vicki sent me a fantastic, if you can find a little podcast interview with Michelle Grattan interviewing Tony Burke. It's the most uplifting thing where he talks about... conversation, it is. He talks about making cultural policy for this country that isn't... He talks about the arts in a way that isn't about it being a decorative thing on your wall and therefore a luxury and therefore irrelevant to working people. And it's so... because he says this is central to thinking about our country. And he said that beautiful thing about... He said the danger in politics is that you can get trapped in non-fiction. And what you need is to step out of facts and go to the place of that mystery and poetry and
the
music.
Bigger thinking.
Because it's about creative thinking. And we need creative thinking for our whole society, not just for, oh, there's artists, aren't they sweet, put them over there. So it's... Anyway, why did I start talking about that?
Yeah, well, we started
the tortured
with
artist
despair
thing,
and we got to joy of an election.
So right now it's like, oh, too much joy. But, you know, it sounds so weird when you say writing a book makes you afraid, it doesn't really make sense logically to be afraid while you're writing, except a psychologist friend of mine, once she explained this, I thought, that explains it. She said, our deepest human need is to belong, right? We need to be part of the tribe. It's like our kind of, you know, prehistoric brain that if you get separated from the tribe, it's extremely dangerous. It's life-threatening. And when you're an artist and you're trying to create something original and new, you are necessarily separating yourself from, you know, mainstream thought and culture. And so that, it's kind of like a really deep, primal kind of fear of being separated from the tribe. And yet you need to separate yourself from the tribe to create work. So once I understood that, it's like, oh, that kind of makes sense then of why this kind of... And also the fear of failure, the fear of exposure, and the fear of... You know, we spend years working on these books that may not work. You know, the risk is enormous that, oh, I've spent 4 years writing this thing that may never see the light of day. So it's kind of insane. And yet there's an exhilaration in that risk as well.
Well, so the despair is real, and you've had days where you really have questioned whether the struggle was worth it. But then you came up with an antidote to that for the bad days. So I wonder if you'd read that to us.
Thank you.
Should be the first
I
marker
did.
there.
This was when I was writing a book called The Natural Way of Things, which was... It turned out to do very well, but while I was writing it, it was just like, what am I doing this for? Because it's it's a pretty dark story. And so... I'll just read it. On one very bad writing day a few years back, I thought again about giving up. I wrote to a couple of my writer friends. And this is what I wrote. Not going so well this week after all. Somehow swamped again with the futility of this work, trying to find the point of writing a dark, bleak book about girls imprisoned and trapped and reviled. Yesterday, I couldn't see how I was not just adding yet more ugliness to the world. But I've just bucked myself up a little bit by writing a list of reasons to keep going. Here's what I came up with. To make something beautiful. Beauty does not have to mean prettiness, but can emerge from the scope of one's imagination, the precision of one's words, the steadiness and honesty of one's gaze. To make something truthful. And it's the Keats quote, beauty is truth, truth beauty. To make use of what you have and who you are. Even a limited talent brings an obligation to explore it, develop it, exercise it, be grateful for it. To make at all. To create is to defy emptiness. It is generous, it affirms. To make is to add to the world, not subtract from it. It enlarges, does not diminish. And because, as Iris Murdoch said, paying attention is a moral act. To write truthfully is to honour the luck and the intricate detail of being alive. I returned to that list for comfort often through the writing of my novel, but it has stayed with me in the years since because I think it speaks to the reasons we need art at all. It often feels that we have entered a new dark age, an age in which science is rejected in favour of superstition and greed, in which our planet is in desperate need of rescue, in which bigotry and religion are inseparable. In the midst of this gloom, to create is an act of enlargement, of affirmation. It lights a candle in the darkness, offering solace, illumination, maybe even the possibility of transformation, not just for the maker, but for the reader or viewer, which is to say all of us. Art urges us to imagine and inhabit lives other than our own, to be more thoughtful, to feel more deeply, to challenge what we think we already know. Art declares that we contain multitudes and that more than one thing can be true at once. And it gives us a breathing space in which we can listen more than talk, where we can attentively question our own beliefs. It gives us a place in this chaotic world in which to find the sort of meaning that only arises out of the stillness deep within our quiet selves. Thank you.
I think your point that art declares that more than one thing can be true at once is really important. I think it's one of art's most important functions. But it's ironic now that although we have more choices than ever, it seems we're increasingly being forced to choose between only one or the other thing. There's always a tension in the writing life between action, the sort of fronting up to the desk and putting your bum down on the chair and just getting on with it, and inaction, the dreamy state, the thinking and the patient waiting that occurs. That's equally a part of writing. You do some of your best work during your afternoon naps, don't you?
I do, but I have to work first. Like, these sort of dreamy, the gifts that come from the unconscious are so crucial. Like, you can't write.
They're earned, aren't they? Yeah.
Yeah, but you have to earn them. So you often, and this is the grumpy struggle thing that Janet Burroway talks about. There's this period of just labour and struggle. And I mean, I think one of the things that you do know the more you go on is you just trust the process more. You don't know how to do it any better, but you understand that, oh, this is normal. The fact that I feel that I can't do this is just part of the deal. It's not, doesn't mean anything about the fact that I can't do it. But there's this tension always, and I think that's one of the things I realised through writing this book about what the artist's place is to live always in a state of tension between certainties. So that, and between certainties of, like moral certainties, but also between these different mind states of sort of this logical, sort of forensic thinking, or this dreamy, loose, kind of nutty thinking. And it's this movement up and down that spectrum that is where you find your work. And napping, napping is very important. Sleep. A lot of artists talk about sleep, and a lot of what I've loved when I've gone to visual artists' studios is quite often they have a bed in there. And I'm like, yes, you need the bed. Because often if I'm having a real, crappy day, which is standard, I will, at a certain point in the afternoon, just go and have a lie down, read for a bit, fall asleep. Especially when I'm reading my own work, fall asleep instantly. Not that I read my books once they're published, I don't mean that I do that, but reading over something that's not working. But often just on waking up, that what I think our friend David Roach calls a liminal space between sleep and wakefulness, is that I feel like it's where your unconscious is more easily accessible. And often there'll be just some little thing you go, I know how to solve that. Or it just gives you a line, to go on with for the afternoon or something. But it's important.
Yeah, it's stepping away from your work. That can be a circuit breaker where the luminous solution pops into your head. Boredom is sort of essential.
Yeah, boredom. It is essential.
And privacy for your artistic vision.
You need to, everyone works differently. When I did that book, The Writer's Room, doing those interviews, the great thing, I basically used these interviews purely selfishly to get myself a little masterclass from all these writers that I really admired. So I'd say, can I interview about your work? And then I look at the questions, like, I know exactly what problem I was having at the time in writing The Natural Way of Things particularly. Because I'd ask them, so do you worry about the darkness in your work? And Malcolm Knox would just go, nah. I'm like, you're allowed not to care about that, So I...
Well, you interviewed other visual artists and actors, and you've also had experience of being in theatre rehearsals. So you've learned from other artists about how they manage sort of criticism and exposure. What did you learn?
Yeah, and also often how they talk about their form, their art form, is so useful for writing. So the kind of most easily identifiable one for me is I recently, a year ago or more, interviewed the painter Jude Ray. I don't know if any of you know her work. She's amazing. She's often in the Archibald and the Sullman and stuff, but the works that I love of hers most are still lifes, these beautiful still lifes. And I wanted to know, so the book that I'm writing now, I sort of realised it has got quite a danger of she said nothing and turned awayness about it. But so I thought maybe I'm sort of writing a still life, which is not good, for a novel. It can't be so still. But I looked at Jude's pictures and I thought, well, these are still lifes, but they're so energetic. They have this kind of, they're almost vibrating with kind of energy. So I wanted to ask her how she got this energy into a static scene. And she was amazing. And the first thing she said was, well, I guess the first thing I would do is break up the surface of the painting. And so when you look at her paintings, the edges are kind of fraying. The canvas is visible, or there's a line where the surface of the table that her objects are on, and then it's just dripping paint below that. So, but as soon as she said that about breaking up the surface, I thought, I know what to do now for the form of my book, to give it pace. I mean, this is bloody fingers crossed, who knows, but to give it sort of pace and energy by breaking up the rhythm of the chapters, or the the length of sentences. And so, her medium is paint, my medium is words. But I can learn from her from her use of paint, what to do with my words. And it's so inspiring. And you never find that in a writing book,
No.
plot, character, dialogue,
And, one of your chapters in the book is called The Paint Itself. Tell us about that.
So the paint itself, there's a quote from a painter I can't remember. Oh, Laurie Feindrich, an American painter, and I read an interview with her in some obscure place, and she said, ever since the invention of painting on canvas, the paint itself has been part of the meaning of a painting. So I just found that very compelling and didn't really know what it means. But when I think about writing, again, I understood what the parallel is, and that is that the language that a writer uses, it isn't just used to describe the thing, the substance. The language is the substance. And the language, the voice of the work is the story, in a really good piece of literature. So that chapter is about sentences. The writer's paint is words and sentences. So I had a great time with our mutual friend Tegan teaching a workshop on what makes a good sentence. And it was so fascinating because it's something you never really thought about. But we just pulled all these books off our shelves and went, well, what's good about this? So we came up with, 5 or 6 things about, authority. God, I can't remember the rest. Anyway, they're all in there. They're amazing. But it was so riveting to us to go through.
Well, to see how much work gets done in the actual sentence itself, and that's where the mastery is. But every element of the big picture can appear within the sentence. The sentence is doing all this small work to make the big picture.
Yeah, the DNA or something. But it's and it's not about fancy language.
No.
It's not about having. Sometimes writing students will say, "How can I improve my vocabulary?" I'm like, you don't have to improve your vocabulary. You just
choose the right one, the right word.
Select, and don't go with what you first put down. It's not. Sometimes it is, but review every single word in your book. And I think sometimes writing students find this really boring.
Well, your students weren't necessarily too thrilled about the workshop you devised for them.
They sort of were, but I think they were like, what do you mean? We just have to... I think I said in that chapter, some of them seemed to think it was like we were telling them to look at the windowsill when there was this amazing view out there. Mm-hmm. But without that attention to the sentence, and like every single word in the book has to be there for a reason. Mm. And I think a lot of early writing students just find that they're too impatient to get to the big things like the plot and the characters and whatever. But, we've all read books where it's like the story might be amazing, but this is so dead. It's not, it doesn't live.
And equally, you've all picked up a book and opened a first 1 or 2 sentences and read, and you're totally riveted and you're in because of the quality of those sentences and some authority and drive that's within them. And you think of someone like
voice,
Vivian
right?
Gornick.
Yeah.
And it's alive immediately. Yet they're plain sentences and...
Yeah, and they're not describing great dramatic events, but there's an authority in the voice. So that, most of the time if I go to a bookshop, I pick up a book, I just look at the first couple of pages, and it's not to do with what it's about. It's to do with that sense of, and often it's authority, isn't it? It's like you feel like you're in safe hands. This person is going somewhere, and I want to go with them. I don't know why.
In fact, they're not waiting around for you,
no, that's
the
right.
reader.
They're going there
anyway.
Yeah. That's exciting.
Yeah. Well, I think we've got time for one more meaty question, which is that you had on your list, why write list, you had to make something truthful. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. But you've been thinking hard about truth and beauty recently, and you think there's a third element to consider when it comes to making art, or if not making art, then consuming it. And that's a respect for radical otherness.
Yeah, it's about... There's a bit in the book about this sort of fashion for empathy, you know, that we... And that a way of talking about literature is, literature is important because it makes us more empathetic. I don't really buy that, unfortunately. I mean, I do think a good work of art, we inhabit that person in the book to a degree that we feel we are that person. And that, to me, is a mark of a great book that, you know... I remember reading Colm Tóibín's book about Henry James, the master. Amazing novel. And I remember thinking, this is so weird. This is about Henry James, but it's actually about me. You know, it's about me and my friendships and that sort of thing. But there's...
So it was relatable.
Yeah, well, now we're getting into murky waters. So this idea of empathy and relatable characters is something that... The chapter that we're talking about, so I'm being very garbled, the chapter is called Reading Isn't Shopping. And it's about how we are, if we're not careful, falling into a kind of mindset about books that is about the book has to please me. And I had one woman commented on one of my social media things saying, I read this book the weekend and I don't recommend it to anybody. I didn't like it at all because my friends and I are the same age as these women, and these women are nothing like us. And I was sort of like really intrigued and kind of depressed by this idea that you're writing a book, your job is to reflect my life. I don't think it is, and I think sometimes we should be reading things that we don't like, you know, because we've learned stuff. Like, when I read Michelle de Kretz's books, there's nothing comfortable about that experience for me at all. It's just, I feel a knot in my gut the whole time I'm reading it. And I don't really want to be in this state, except I know it opens up my mind and it makes me look at the way I behave in the world. It makes me look at the way our culture is set up. And it makes me think, whoa, this stuff that we need to fix here. And it's not empathy. I don't feel that, oh, I understand, you know, Sri Lankan refugees now because I read this book. But it's about actually realising that and Sarah Santellis is the one who uses this term, radical otherness, as a kind of alternative to empathy. It means, so she says that the empathy depends on perceived likeness. It's like, I can respect you because I see that you and I are really the same. And then she says, well, what happens when we're not the same? And we're never going to be the same. What we need is a respect for otherness that more than we need empathy. So, yeah, that's that little rant.
Well, really, we've pretty much got towards the close of our session here, except for question time, if there are any folks with questions. Yes, hello. I don't know if there's a mic coming.
Oh,
yes,
there's a mic
there
coming,
is.
Thank you.
Thank you for a most illuminating segment. I'm hesitate to use the word poet, but I write poetry. And I work with a group, and we get together every month. And this is possibly a good segue for this. I'm just wondering how you handle other people's comments on your work. And because I just find with the poetry, when we sit around with the group and everyone gives great feedback, I am really torn between the fact that they think that's how it should be and my voice.
Such a great, great question. And actually I have a whole chapter in this book about this thing of giving and receiving feedback on unfinished work. And I have a horror of creative writing classes where students workshop each other's work, because I have seen it destroy people. And, you know, Vicki and I met in a creative writing class, and, you know, you saw some of the ways that some of the students responded to each other's work that was, A, brutal beyond belief, and B, I would always think, well, why am I listening to you? You don't know any more than I do, you know. I would listen to the teacher's feedback because she had written books, and often there are so many unspoken agendas going on in classrooms, and we had an example of it this week with a friend who teaches. You know, she was having to kind of hose down one of the students who was just being really cruel about another person's work. So the way that we have always worked with responding to each other's work is it's not about critique. It's not about critique. It's about helping the writer bring to fruition what they want to bring to fruition, not the way that I would do it. And, you know, Vicki and I, our writing is so different. But I would never... It would be impossible to say, well, you should do this, that's what I would do, because it would just destroy it. So what we tend to do is ask questions, is just say, this bit here is really, I don't understand it. Why did you do that? What do you mean? How have you thought of another way of doing it? Sort of digging deeper into it rather than saying this doesn't work because X, Y, Z. But there's also the point that you raise is, okay, even if that all happens and there's a firm conclusion that everybody has drawn that this doesn't work, but I still like it, then I would always go with I still like it. And that's the artist. There's a beautiful short documentary on Rosalie Gascoigne. It's in the National Film and Sound Archive, and there's bits of it on YouTube. If you just Google Rosalie Gascoigne, you can see all these little clips. And she says, whenever I put up a show, the only thing I care about is it self-respecting? And if I respect it and the work respects itself, then I don't care what other people think. And she said, but I have very high standards. You know, she will, like her standards of what's self-respecting will be higher than most people's. But she says the artist has absolute jurisdiction over their own work. And I think every artist has to learn that and claim it. And that's hard to do, especially when we start off, we're in a little creative tribe with other people who, you know, keep us going. But sometimes those people can be the ones sort of, you know, just, well, A, they might not know, and B, they can fear your development, and I'm not saying your group, this is just completely general. What were you going to say?
Just that the bottom line is you do need a ruthless streak about what's at the core of what you're doing.
That's where you get your material, is the stuff that's only you know, that you can learn from all these other people, as I'm just constantly, you know, just grasping at people and saying, help me. But it's, in the end, it's got to be self-respecting and you have absolute jurisdiction. And then that doesn't mean that it's going to be published or out in the world. That's a whole other topic. And often it'll mean that it won't be. So that's, you know, that's the line of courage, I guess, of how much, and nobody can tell you. That's the awful thing. You have to figure it out, where the line is between claiming your territory and sticking with it, or, you know, changing it to suit other people's desires. And it's hard. It's a hard line. Good question, though. Thank you.
And we have a question here at the
comes
front.
The microphone. But other people might.
Here it comes.
It's just a simple question, I think. You say you have a gift or you need a gift, and I really believe that in writing, because I know I couldn't sit down and write a book, even if I took years, and it sounds very difficult listening to you, the process, but I can remember reading kindergarten children's writing, and I could see there was a gift with some children. Were you aware when you had this gift, or it came forth, or did teachers point it out to you, or... Because, I think it must be a long way back that this gift came out in your writing.
Thank you, Pam. I always loved English at school. I loved writing essays. I loved reading. I was, like all writers, really. You're that kid with a nose in the book, wherever you are, etc. But I never thought I could write a novel, ever. Like, I was 30 before I started trying to write fiction. So I never thought I had a gift for making things up. I never did that kind of writing. When we were at school, you might have had a composition where you had to write about what you did on holidays or something, but it wasn't like go and make up a story. So I just never thought I could ever do that. And it was... But I loved words. I started journalism because I thought I wanted to work with words, and I was a terrible journalist because I hated ringing people up on the phone. I was like, oh. But I do think my parents were very creative people. They were always making things. You made your Christmas decorations, or you made books, like picture books, or, our dad was one of those people who could made furniture, made electrical things, that kind of person. And my mother was a florist. So there was making around us all the time. And that was more important than writing. So that sense that making something was a natural part of living, and it gave you pleasure and absorption and sort of purpose. So my mother was one of those mothers who'd say, if you're bored, well, go and do something constructive. Like literally constructive. Go make something. And I think it just internalised that very early. And I feel really grateful for that.
Well, I think that's all we have time for. We have one more question. Are we allowed to sneak some more? Yes, thank you.
Thank you. I was fortunate enough last night to hear John Bell speak, and he was lamenting the loss of the art of listening. And of course he was referencing Shakespeare, and mentioned that in Shakespeare's time people had to rely very heavily on the spoken word for information, and when Shakespeare's describing a particular scene or a landscape, it's often described by the chorus in the play. There are no visual cues. It's quite a bare stage, and people have to imagine where they are and transport themselves there from the spoken word. Do you feel that the loss of, or the diminishment of the art of listening, because we're bombarded so much by visual images these days, has made your task harder as a writer?
It's a really interesting point. I just read an amazing article this morning in... does anyone read Aeon magazine? A-E-O-N? It's online. It's this fantastic sort of philosophical magazine, and they have a thing about the art of listening, more in a kind of psychology sense. But I do think we're bombarded with images constantly, and I mean, you're right that reading is listening, really. Reading is an act of imagining what is being told to you. I think part of that, I don't know if it makes our work harder. Maybe it makes, the reception of the work more variable. I don't know. But I know that for us, reading the work aloud is really crucial. It's about the rhythm of a sentence. And that stuff we were talking about before about the work of sentences is so much about the rhythm, and that is about listening, or about being heard. And it's a very garbled answer, I'm sorry. But it's quite the spokenness of of language is really crucial to me. When I finish a book, I mean, I read it aloud all the time as I go, but when in the proofreading process, I read it aloud from beginning to end. And that's when you hear mistake, not just like errors, but you hear infelicities, you hear false notes, you hear when you're sort of lying a little bit, you hear when you are saying something you don't really mean, and you don't know it until you read it aloud. Well, that's what I feel like.
That's very true.
Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you everybody for coming along today, and of course a special thank you to Charlotte. Thanks
you,
for speaking
Vicki.
with us today.
Thanks to Vic.
I was just going to say that I just can't wait to see what Charlotte's sharp intellect will serve up to us next. What truth and beauty or radical otherness you'll present. I hope it won't be too long and we'll be all here discussing that book. Thank you
so much. Thank you. Thanks all for coming.